Acting morally means acting out of duty for the sake of the moral law. The moral law consists of a categorical imperative, a principle that requires us to treat persons with respect, as an ends in themselves. Only when I act in accordance with the categorical imperative am I acting freely. For whenever I act according to a hypothetical imperative, I act for the sake of some interest or end. Page 124 of Justice. Duty versus inclination. Factors that constitute one's duty. 1. Reason. Not using people as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves. Not out of emotion, which also includes a selfish desire of self-preservation, which violates the previous. Number 2. Intent in accordance to number 1. According to Kant, the moral worth of an action consists not in the consequences that flow from it, but in the intention from which the act is done. Page 111 from Justice. What matters is doing the right. The clearest examples of morally right action are precisely those in which an individual agent's determination to act in accordance with duty overcomes her evident self-interest and obvious desire to do otherwise. Thing because it's right, not for some ulterior motives. Could be a specific consequence or reward or fulfilling a desire. Page 111 to page 112 in Justice. And this right thing is one's duty. Yes, because human beings are rational and have free will. Quote, now I affirm that we must attribute to every rational being which has a will that it has also the idea of freedom and acts entirely under this idea. For in such a being we conceive a reason that is practical, that is, has causality in reference to its objects. End quote from Kant, page 65. Based upon this, it is possible for a person's morality to change, depending on whether or not the individual puts reason over emotion, fulfills their duty, and holds good intentions within their action, which all three are talked about in the previous question. Morality is subject to change because the factors that constitute it do. The second proposition is that an action done from duty derives its moral worth, not from the purpose which it is attained by it, but from the maxim by which it is determined, and therefore does not depend on the realization of the object of the action, but merely on the principle of volition by which the action has taken place, without regard to any object of desire. Page 16, Metaphysics of Morals. Intentions, rather than consequences, constitute moral worth, for intentions rely upon reason over emotion, universal maxims, and duty. A negative consequence or outcome does not reduce moral worth if the intention was good. Reference to page 111 of Justice.
Characters. Chillingworth and Dimmesdale.
Before the book, Dimmesdale and Hester commit adultery. We put this at -5 because his intentions were wrong, because he was seeking pleasure. Dimmesdale uses Hester as a means to an end. According to Exodus 20:14, thou shalt not commit adultery. Dimmesdale abides by the God's law. By committing adultery, he's going completely against God's law, which is contradictory to his duty as a minister. In Chapter 3, Dimmesdale lies when he is interrogating Hester on the scaffold. He asks Hester multiple times who the father of the child is, but he actually is. He is not only lying to himself, but to his fellow people. He fears to be shamed in front of society. Instead of doing the right thing, he fears the reactions that he will receive. He is a man of emotion rather than reason. He does the opposite of what society would want him to do. As being the minister, society would like him to be honest with them. On page 62, he says, I charge thee to speak out the name of thy fellow sinner and fellow sufferer. Also on page 62, he says, take heed how thou deniest to him, who perchance hath not the courage to grasp it for himself.
In Chapter 8, Dimmesdale proves his morality through his justification as to why pearls should not be given to the hands of another individual other than Hester. He essentially recognizes Pearl's worth as an individual and concedes to his obligation to God's law, which he is accountable to, as he exemplifies its authority over his decisions. In speaking to Chillingworth and Governor Bellingham, Dimmesdale says, "She recognizes, believe me, the solemn miracle which God hath wrought in the existence of that child. Therefore it is good for this poor sinful woman that she hath an infant immortality, a being capable of eternal joy or sorrow confided to her care, to be trained up by her to righteousness, to remind her at every moment of her fall, but yet to teach her, as it were by the Creator's sacred pledge, that if she bring the child to heaven, the child also will bring its parent thither. Herein is the sinful mother happier than the sinful father. For Hester Prynne's sake, then, and no less for the poor child's sake, let us leave them as Providence hath seen fit to place them." Hawthorne 101-102. It is through this that we may see that Dimmesdale's value of moral worth is at a 3 due to his good intent of bringing Hester comfort and allowing her to keep what she claims is her only treasure. Thus, Dimmesdale's intent here is for the needs of Hester rather than his own, proving that his intent is not based on selfish desires, which Kant argues goes against what is considered to be doing the right thing for the right reason. He also follows his duty in which he feels the need to provide for Pearl to receive the best and most natural care from her mother after having neglected his own daughter. However, he must do so without revealing himself as the one with whom Hester committed adultery with.
Up until this point, Dimmesdale chooses to stay in Boston, rather than running away to Europe with Hester. He's putting his duty of being a minister first. Even though he has committed an unfaithful sin, he's putting God and his people before him. Dimmesdale is choosing not to run away from his problems and fears. He's willing to do what he has been destined to do. Quote, "The judgment of God is on me," end quote, page 171 of the Scarlet Letter. This would be a 2 on the graph because he is putting his duty as a minister before anything else, and he has the option to run away and not to have to worry about anything, but he chooses to stay loyal to God and his people. Although he has the right intention, he is deciding to stay because the society would want him to. This is supported on page 172 of the Scarlet Letter. Quote, "Wretched and sinful as I am, I have had no other thought than to drag on my earthly existence in the sphere where Providence hath placed me. Lost as my own soul is, I would still do what I may for other human souls. I dare not quit my post, though an unfaithful sentinel, whose sure reward is death and dishonor, when his dreary watch shall come to an end." End quote.
In Chapter 19, we see Dimmesdale with Hester and Pearl in the forest. We place his morality at a -5. On page 180, it says, "This dear child has caused me many an alarm. Methought, O Hester, that my own features were partly repeated in her face, and so strikingly that the world might see them, but she is mostly thine." On page 185, we see, "But in days to come he will walk hand in hand with us. We will have a home and fireside of our own, and thou shalt sit upon his knee, and he will teach thee many things and love thee dearly." Dimmesdale agreeing to run away with Hester shows emotion ruling over his reason. For him and his family, running away shows that they are still not acting upon a better moral code, but are trying to find ways to still defy the same old social codes, just as they did when they committed adultery. We see him doing it out of the impulse for not wanting to reveal his sin and for self-preservation rather than good intent. We see that this is a more selfish act through his want for Pearl's affection, yet refusing to take responsibility as her father, which will only come through his confession. He doesn't fulfill his duty as Pearl's father, is overcome with emotion, and makes a decision not out of good intention, but rather for the sake of self-preservation. In Chapter 20, we see Dimmesdale walking out of the forest after his encounter with Hester and Pearl. We place his morality at a 3. On page 190, we see, "At every step he was incited to do some strange, wild, wicked thing with a sense profounder than that it would be at once involuntary and intentional, in spite of himself, yet growing out of a profounder self than that which opposed the impulse. It was only by the most careful self-control that the former could refrain from uttering certain blasphemous suggestions that rose into his mind respecting the communion supper." We see Dimmesdale walking out of nature, having the potential to succumb to the evil that is within each individual. Hester's influence upon him is obvious, yet Dimsdale chooses not to do these actions, for his reason prevents himself from doing so. It is within this chapter we see that he overcomes the struggle between emotion and reason, resulting in a balance of the two. Dimsdale has the intention of preserving the people he runs into from his duty as their minister, and his new profound balance of reason and emotion, yet he would not be placed higher, for he has not found it within himself to come forth, repent, and fully fulfill his duty as their minister, as well as Pearl's father, to bring about change. In chapter 23, we see Dimsdale coming forth and repenting for his sins. We placed his morality at a 5. On page 221 we see, he threw off all assistance and stepped passionately forward a pace before the woman and the child. It was revealed. The minister stood with the flush of triumph in his face, as one who, in the crisis of acutest pain, had won a victory. On page 222 we see, Pearl kissed his lips. A spell was broken. God knows, and he is merciful. By bringing me hither to die this death of triumphant ignominy before the people, had either of these agonies been wanting, I had been lost forever. Praised be his name, he will be done. With the acceptance of both reason and emotion, we see that Dimsdale understands that the sole act of revealing his sin must be done on his own, without the support of anyone else. He also understands that he cannot run from the truth that his conscience and mind believe in, which fulfills his duty of doing what he believes is the right thing to do. He understands that he can't escape God, and it is only within his confession that he can gain peace. The intent of his confession and death was not just for himself, but for everyone else, and reflects Jesus Christ and how he died for the sins of his society. It is through Dimsdale that society is able to recognize that people sin and that one can be redeemed. Dimsdale becomes a catalyst for change. Dimsdale fulfills his duty as Pearl's father, as well as society's minister, to shed light upon the cruelties within the society. Within his confession, we see reason, good intent, and fulfillment of this duty.
Before the book began, Chillingworth sends Hester across the ocean all by herself. He's immoral because he's not doing the right thing, because he is expecting to receive something out of what he has done, for the betterment of himself. This is immoral because, by leaving Hester, he is just interested in bettering himself as an individual. Kant says, what matters is doing the right thing because it's right, not for some ulterior motive. Justice, page 111 to 112. We put him at -1 because he had selfish intentions. On page 57 of the Scarlet Letter it says, to this purpose he sent his wife before him, remaining himself to look after some necessary affairs. That's my first one. Even not.
Chapter 4 is the first time Chillingworth and Hester have a conversation with each other after many years. He goes to the jail as the doctor to help cure Hester and Pearl as they just were standing on the scaffold of shame. He gives Hester and Pearl medicine so they can live longer to suffer. We put this event on positive 2 because he is a man of reason. By doing this, he is going out of his way to cure them. Chillingworth represents the Puritan society and their skewed sense of justice. By offering them medicine, he keeps them alive so he can find out who the father of the child is. His intention was right, therefore his moral worth increases according to moral law. Reference to Justice, page 111. Live therefore, and bear about thy doom with thee, in the eyes of men and women, in the eyes of him whom thou didst call thy husband, in the eyes of yonder child. Hawthorne, page 67. In chapter 9, Chillingworth's morality decreases, as his value of moral worth shifts to become a -2. This is because of the observations made by those in society of the change that Chillingworth has displayed of his moral character. It is said that Roger Chillingworth's aspect had undergone a remarkable change while he had dwelt in town, and especially since his abode with Mr. Dimsdale. At first, his expression had been calm, meditative, scholar-like. Now there was something ugly and evil in his face which they had not previously noticed, and which grew still the more obvious to sight the more oftener they looked upon him. Hawthorne 1:12. Chillingworth is a -2 here because his descent of morality begins here, as he proves to be more immoral in later chapters through his revenge against Dimsdale. His morality is still within the negative region because of the traits he displays due to his weakness against emotion. He therefore does not act upon reason, and instead possesses bad intent in his pursuit to find who Hester committed adultery with. As his emotion, in this case revenge, overrides his reason, Chillingworth represents a skewed form of justice.
Chillingworth makes Dimmesdale think that he is the ultimate sinner. He eats away at Dimmesdale's soul. Chillingworth psychologically tortures Dimmesdale. He has completely transformed himself into a devil. His quote-unquote attacks begin to affect Dimmesdale at a much stronger level. At this point of the book, Chillingworth is completely consumed by seeking revenge. He has a wrong intention of destroying Dimmesdale and only seeks to do so for his own satisfaction. He no longer feels that it is his duty to reveal Hester's fellow sinner for the people, but only for his own peace of mind. This would be a -4 in the graph because Chillingworth has the capacity to do more extreme and harmful things to not only Dimmesdale but Hester and Pearl. And he has the wrong intentions and is doing everything for his own benefit. This is supported by the quote on page 148 of the Scarlet Letter. Roger Chillingworth was the striking evidence of a man's faculty of transforming himself into a devil, if he will only, for a reasonable space of time, undertake a devil's office. This unhappy person had effected such a transformation by devoting himself for 7 years to the constant analysis of a heart full of torture, and deriving his enjoyment thence and adding fuel to those fiery tortures which he analyzed and gloated over.
As you can see in the graph, from the beginning of the book to chapter 4, there are parallel lines between Dimmesdale and Chillingworth. We can argue that there is no direct relationship between the two people, for they do not even know the other exists. The impact of Dimmesdale's act will affect Chillingworth's morality later on. No specific point can be determined at which the two characters directly intersect one another due to their interactions. However, their lines intersect between chapters 5 and 8, although there is no direct intersection point because of their relationship with one another through Pearl, Hester's daughter. This occurs as Dimmesdale makes his ascent towards morality, while Chillingworth makes his descent. Dimmesdale's guilt causes him to feel the necessary responsibility for Pearl, whereas Chillingworth also faces guilt because of the fact that he isn't able to take responsibility for Pearl as his own daughter, because it is not his child and is thus a product of Hester's sin. However, he does not do anything about it, which causes his morality to decrease. There is overall negative slopes for both graphs, starting from chapter 8 through Dimmesdale and chapter 4 for Chillingworth. We see that Chillingworth's morality decreases as he slowly becomes consumed by revenge. His actions, as a result of his decline due to Dimmesdale's act of adultery, lowers Dimmesdale's moral worth. We see Chillingworth constantly inflicting pain and torture upon Dimmesdale, which causes him to become distraught. It forces Dimmesdale to embrace emotion as it serves as relief from his pain, as seen in his encounter with Hester in the forest.
Counter-argument. In chapter 4, one may argue that Chillingworth should be on the lower scale of the graph, because he offers medicine not only out of kindness and generosity, but rather because he wants Hester and Pearl to survive, to feel more suffering and pain. His intent were clouded by emotion. However, this is untrue because Chillingworth begins off as a man of reason and not emotion. He is heavily influenced by the Puritan society to find out who the father of the child is, and it is the society that shapes his sense of justice. But the man lives who has wronged us both. Who is he? On page 69. He does not want to be their friend. He just wants to cure them so he can figure out things. He says, "Recognize me not by word, by sign, by look." This quote shows how Chillingworth does not intend to be a part of their lives, but rather find out the other sinner so that he can punish him, fulfilling his duty to execute justice, no matter how skewed it may be. And because this duty does not arrive from his emotions come into play later on, which changes his intent from seeking justice to revenge. One may also argue that Dimmesdale in chapter 3 can be seen as moral by not claiming that he is the father of the child. For by doing this, he is taking upon his role as society's minister. The townspeople look to him for advice, help, and model of good. However, this is incorrect because Dimsdale starts off as a man of emotion rather than reason, and according to Kant, one's moral worth rises when reason rather than emotion. Dimsdale does not carry out his actions for the sake of his duty, but rather his self-preservation, for he fears the judgment of the citizens who hold him up as an example of holiness and good. The moral act for Dimsdale to do would be to confess. His confession would allow him to take responsibility of his actions and Pearl, to whom he owes his duty as her father.